May 1945. The Elbe River, Germany. American and Soviet soldiers meet in the middle of a destroyed bridge and embrace. They are laughing. Some are crying. They have just, together, defeated the most destructive military force in human history. They are allies. They are friends. They have fought toward each other across an entire continent. 2 years later, the same two nations are dividing the same continent with barbed wire. Their armies face each other across fortified borders. Their leaders exchange threats. Their scientists race to build weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. The alliance is gone. In its place, a conflict that will last 45 years, consume trillions of dollars, and bring the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation, not once, but several times. How did it happen so fast? That is the question historians have been arguing about for 80 years. And it is not a simple question, because the answer depends entirely on who you ask and what evidence you choose to believe. This video is going to give you all of it. The facts, the interpretations, and the verdict, or the closest thing to one that history allows. Who really started the Cold War? To understand how the alliance collapsed, you have to understand how fragile it always was. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin were never natural partners. They were three men bound together by a single shared enemy, Hitler, and by the practical necessity of defeating him. Beyond that, they agreed on almost nothing. Stalin was the leader of a communist state that had spent 20 years predicting the inevitable collapse of Western capitalism. Churchill was the embodiment of British imperial conservatism, a man who had supported military intervention against the Bolsheviks in 1919. Roosevelt was somewhere in between, idealistic, pragmatic, convinced he could manage Stalin personally where others had failed. Their first face-to-face meeting, the Tehran Conference in November 1943, revealed the tensions beneath the surface. Stalin wanted one thing above all else: a second front. An Allied invasion of Western Europe to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union, which had been absorbing the full weight of the German military for 2 years at catastrophic cost. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people in World War II. 27 million. Every decision Stalin made in 1945 and afterward must be understood through that number. Churchill wanted to protect British imperial interests in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Roosevelt wanted a post-war world built on international institutions, the United Nations, and self-determination. 3 visions, 3 sets of interests, 1 temporary alliance. The moment Germany surrendered, the glue dissolved. February 1945. Yalta, Crimea. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met for the last time. Roosevelt was visibly ill. He would be dead in 2 months. The war in Europe was nearly over. The decisions made at this table would shape the continent for the next 50 years. What actually happened at Yalta has been debated ever since. The agreed framework was straightforward on paper. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Eastern European nations would hold free elections and form democratic governments. The Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan in exchange for territorial concessions in Asia. But the devil was in the details and in the definitions. When Stalin agreed to free elections in Poland, he had a very different understanding of the word free than Roosevelt or Churchill did. When the agreement spoke of friendly governments on the Soviet border, Stalin interpreted friendly to mean governments that would never threaten Soviet security, which in practice meant governments Moscow could control. Churchill, more cynical and more clear-eyed than Roosevelt about Soviet intentions, had already tried a different approach. In October 1944, he had met privately with Stalin in Moscow and proposed what became known as the Percentages Agreement, a blunt division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Greece would be 90% British, Romania would be 90% Soviet, Yugoslavia and Hungary split 50-50. Stalin took Churchill's paper and made a large tick on it with a blue pencil. Roosevelt was not present. He was never told about the Percentages Agreement. Yalta, in the end, produced documents that both sides signed and neither side fully intended to honor. The Soviets moved immediately to consolidate control over Eastern Europe, The Americans protested. The British watched. The gap between what was agreed at Yalta and what actually happened in the following months was the first major crack in the alliance. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry Truman became President of the United States, and for the first time, he was briefed on the Manhattan Project. The most powerful weapon in human history was weeks away from completion, and the new president had known nothing about it. 3 months later, at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman met Stalin for the first time. On July 24th, he approached Stalin after a plenary session and mentioned, almost casually, that the United States had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin's reaction was notably calm. He said he hoped America would make good use of it against Japan. What Truman did not know, and what historians confirmed decades later, was that Soviet intelligence had been penetrating the Manhattan Project for years. Stalin already knew about the bomb. His calm was not ignorance, it was control. But knowing about the bomb and facing its reality were different things. When the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending the Pacific War in days, the message to Moscow was unmistakable. America possessed a weapon the Soviet Union did not have. A weapon that could destroy a city in seconds. A weapon that made conventional military strength, the one area where the Soviet Union was genuinely formidable, suddenly less relevant. Stalin immediately accelerated the Soviet nuclear program. He told his scientists they had no more than 5 years. They delivered in 4. But in the intervening years, America's atomic monopoly fundamentally altered every negotiation, every confrontation, every diplomatic exchange between the two powers. The Soviets knew they were negotiating from a position of strategic vulnerability, and they behaved accordingly, with paranoia, with aggression, with an urgent need to establish buffer zones and satellite states that would give them strategic depth. Whether America's atomic monopoly caused Soviet expansionism or merely accelerated it is one of the central questions of Cold War historiography. March 5, 1946. Fulton, Missouri. Westminster College. Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister but still one of the most famous men on earth, delivered a speech that gave the Cold War its defining image. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Iron Curtain. The phrase entered the language immediately and has never left it. Churchill's speech was not just a description. It was a call to action, a demand that the United States and Britain stand together against Soviet expansion. He explicitly called for an Anglo-American military alliance to counter the Soviet threat. Stalin's response was volcanic. He called Churchill a warmonger. He compared the speech to Hitler's racial theories. He said it was a call for war against the Soviet Union. Was Churchill right? Or was he provoking the very conflict he claimed to be warning against? The revisionist historians, who we'll come to shortly, argue that the Iron Curtain speech was itself a destabilizing act, that it hardened positions on both sides, made compromise less likely, and accelerated the division of Europe into hostile blocs. The orthodox historians argue that Churchill was simply describing reality. The Iron Curtain existed whether or not anyone named it. Both are partly right, which is the pattern you will notice throughout this story. By 1947, the lines were hardening fast. In February, Britain told the United States it could no longer afford to support the Greek government in its civil war against communist insurgents. The message was clear. If America didn't step in, Greece might fall to communism. Truman went to Congress. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, he declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by outside pressures. It was, in effect, a declaration that America would oppose communist expansion anywhere in the world. Then came the Marshall Plan. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a massive American aid program for the reconstruction of Europe, eventually $13 billion, equivalent to roughly $150 billion today. The stated goal was economic recovery. The Marshall Plan was offered to all European nations, including the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites. Stalin refused. and he pressured every Eastern European government under Soviet influence to refuse as well. His reasoning was straightforward. Accepting American money meant accepting American conditions, American inspectors, American influence. It meant opening Soviet-controlled economies to Western scrutiny. He would not allow it. The refusal was a turning point. Western Europe rebuilt with American money and moved toward prosperity and democratic consolidation. Eastern Europe remained under Soviet control, isolated from Western capital, locked into a different economic and political orbit. The division of Europe, which had been forming since 1945, was now essentially complete. Two worlds, one continent. No agreement on how it had happened or who was responsible. The world you're looking at right now was built in less than 2 years. If you want to understand the decisions and the people who made them, that shaped the world we still live in today, this is the channel for that. Subscribe. New video every week. Don't miss what comes next. So, who started the Cold War? Historians have been arguing about this question for 80 years. 3 broad schools of thought have emerged. The orthodox view, dominant until the 1960s, places the blame squarely on the Soviet Union. Stalin was an expansionist dictator who used the cover of post-war reconstruction to impose communist governments on Eastern Europe, violating the agreements made at Yalta. American policy was a defensive response to Soviet aggression. Soviet behavior in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. The communist coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, the Berlin blockade, the consistent pattern of Soviet expansion wherever the Red Army had reached. The revisionist view, developed by American historians in the 1960s, shaped partly by Vietnam-era skepticism of American foreign policy, shifts significant blame to the United States. America's atomic monopoly was inherently threatening to the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan was a tool of American economic imperialism. The Truman Doctrine was an open-ended commitment to intervene anywhere in the world that suited American interests. America's refusal to share nuclear technology. The economic terms attached to Marshall Plan aid. The pattern of American support for anti-communist governments regardless of their democratic credentials. The post-revisionist view, which emerged in the 1970s and remains the dominant academic position today, argues that both sides bear responsibility, that the Cold War emerged from structural tensions that neither side fully controlled, and that the personalities and decisions of individual leaders mattered less than the systemic forces pushing the two superpowers apart. The incompatibility of American and Soviet security interests in Europe, which would have produced conflict regardless of who was in power. Each of these frameworks captures something true. None of them captures everything. The orthodox view is right that Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe violated the Yalta agreements and imposed communist governments on populations that had not chosen them. The revisionist view is right that America's atomic monopoly was a form of coercion, and that American policy was not purely defensive. The post-revisionist view is right that structural forces, the power vacuum in post-war Europe, the incompatibility of the two systems, the legacy of mutual suspicion, made some form of conflict between the superpowers extremely likely regardless of individual decisions. In May 1945, American and Soviet soldiers embraced on a bridge over the Elbe River. By 1947, their governments were adversaries. By 1949, the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. By 1961, a wall divided Berlin. By 1962, the world came within hours of nuclear war over missiles in Cuba. The men on that bridge in 1945 could not have imagined what was coming. The Cold War lasted 45 years. It shaped every corner of the world. It ended not with a battle, but with the quiet collapse of one of the two systems, the Soviet Union dissolving in 1991, almost without violence, almost without warning. Who started it? The Soviets violated their agreements and imposed their system on half a continent. The Americans used their atomic monopoly as diplomatic leverage and drew lines around the world that they would defend by any means necessary. Both things are true. The real answer may be that nobody started it, and that is the most unsettling conclusion of all.